1st of November election and the formation of the extremist Israeli government caused several interconnected explosive processes. Speaking on this very forum on the 5th of February, I spoke about one of these, the turbocharged oppression in the occupied territories. And my predictions that I gave at that meeting about have been proved right. I predicted the escalation in the dynamic, in the context of the brutal Israeli military occupation. There is escalation in the dialectic of, on the one hand, Israeli brutal military raids of assassination into Nablus and Jenin and elsewhere, and the 26th of February pogrom in Hawara, which of course occurred under the protection of the Israeli military. They have done nothing to prevent it, and they've done nothing to punish the culprits, who are very well known to them. They have got very good intelligence as to who was involved. They are doing nothing about it because they are actually protecting it. But this time I will address the other important explosive process that was triggered off by the Israeli elections, and that is the internal Israeli crisis of the ruling class. There have been huge demonstrations, I think now for 12 weeks, escalating. The peak was reached last Saturday, not yesterday, but last Saturday, on the total demonstrating against the so-called reforms instigated by the ruling coalition. These demos have reached the peak of estimated at 500,000 demonstrators. This would translate, if correct, this would translate to 2.5 million demonstrating around Britain. It's huge and unprecedented in Israel. By the way, I've spotted here a couple of comrades who are in Israel, and they may be able to correct some of my statements because they are obviously more up to date than I am. But I leave this for the discussion. So these demonstrations have been mainly about the reforms designated to weaken the judiciary, mainly the judicial branch of the government. They have been called a judicial coup, as well as other promised legislation designed to create an openly illiberal, autocratic, and theocratic regime. And also, they have been designed to make these changes irreversible or very difficult to reverse. On the other hand, the mainstream demos do not raise the issue of the occupation, the settlements, and the colonial conflict between Israel and the Palestinian Arab people. Of course, there are relatively small blocks that have joined the demonstrations under these other demands or other these slogans. But they are not sponsored by the organizers of the mainstream demonstrations. Initially, I mean, they were actually quite aggressive to anyone who raised such slogans against the occupation, let alone raise a Palestinian flag. Later, these minority blocs have been able to raise these slogans, but on their own initiative, not encouraged by the main demonstrators, by the main organizers of the demonstration. The legislation has been spearheaded by two members of the coalition, the Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, and the head of the Knesset legislative committee, Simcha Rothman. Where was I? The demonstrations are quite orderly and well organized, with almost military precision, and this is not a coincidence. I'll refer to the military aspect of the background of the people organizing the demonstration. This is, in fact, a major class struggle, but not struggle between classes. It is a struggle within a class, between two sections of the ruling class, the Jewish Israeli bourgeoisie. In some ways, it is part of a world phenomenon. There are obvious analogies and similarities between this struggle and what goes on elsewhere. The United States is a very good case to compare. I don't need to tell you that there has been developing over recent years a deep rift within the United States, the American ruling class, between the so-called liberal section of the ruling class. Liberal always, when I mention it in this context, in scare quotes, double scare quotes. So on the one hand, the so-called liberal section of the bourgeoisie, and on the other hand, the populist bourgeoisie. In the United States, this section is more or less taken over the Republican Party. As in the United States, the populist section of the ruling class has managed to appeal successfully to sections of the working class. And this applies also in the case of Israel. Sections of the Israeli working class have followed the lead of the populist bourgeoisie. And also, as in the United States, the populist bourgeoisie is in alliance with religious fundamentalists. The same applies in Israel. So this is, if you like, a global phenomenon, but of course it has very specific Israeli characteristics. And I'd like to go into these. The liberal bourgeois protesters are largely secular. Of course, all these are generalizations. It doesn't apply to all individuals involved, but it is more or less statistically the majority or a great part of the of those whom I'm talking about. So they are largely secular, Ashkenazi, and militaristic, which is very Israeli specific of this part of the liberal bourgeoisie. It doesn't apply in other countries, certainly not in the United States, in the sense that I'm going to explain. Certainly, the leading groups behind these protests are strongly militaristic. They are a part of the Israeli military elite. The liberal bourgeoisie in Israel doesn't only have the support of the military elite, it comprises a big part of the military elite. In fact, it used to be the case that the Israeli military was overall based on reserve service. I mean, it was based on a large part of its forces being reservists called up. This is no longer the case. So the description that they used to like to put forward of the Israeli army as a people's army, in the sense that it's based on ordinary people called for reserve duty every year. This is no longer true globally, but it is true for certain very key professions in the army or sections of the army. I'd like to mention the most salient parts of the Israeli military that is strongly dependent on reserve duty. Cyber and military intelligence units, pilots of the Israeli Air Force, combat medics. Now, it was these groups that have been very active in organizing the protests. People who are key members of the, and essential members of the Israeli military. The pilots, air pilots are called very frequently to reserve duty. Military doctors are called up to, are liable to be called up until they reach the age of 51. This is a very extreme case in Israel. Most people don't get called up so often, and certainly not till they reach the age of 51. So what have we got? On the 13th of March, I'm quoting from the Financial Times, hundreds of reservists from across the military, including elite cyber and military intelligence units, pilots and combat medics, have in recent weeks warned that they will refuse to train or carry out reserve duty if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition presses ahead with the plans, with this legislation. That is the Financial Times of the 13th. Haaretz on the 16th of March, just a few days ago, tells us that hundreds of Israeli soldiers and officers from the military intelligence, special operations and cyber units announced in a letter on last Thursday, that they will not report for reserve duty as of Sunday in protest against the government's judicial overhaul. We don't have a contract with a dictator. We will gladly return and volunteer once democracy is assured, they said. That's from Haaretz on the 16th. Especially noticeable was the refusal of 37 out of 40 reserve pilots of the elite Squadron 69. I'm quoting from The Guardian of the 7th of March. Growing numbers of Israeli military reservists, including members of its most important Air Force squadron, are refusing to attend for service, an unprecedented step that comes as part of the protest movement against the country's new far-right government. That's The Guardian of the 7th of March. What is so special about this Squadron 69 is you can make out, if you look it up in Wikipedia, it is these, I'm quoting now from Wikipedia about the squadron. It is these capabilities, long range and endurance capabilities, that place 69 Squadron at the forefront of Israel's strategic arm and it is thus this unit that is reputed to have undertaken Operation Orchard, the destruction of Syrian nuclear site in September 6, 2007. And now note this final sentence. This squadron has also been linked to a possible Israeli strike against the Iranian nuclear program. They are specialized in long-range raids of this type. So this actually connects somehow to the second part of this meeting regarding Iran. They refused to turn up for a day or two training around the 7th of this month. In the end, they compromised. They agreed to turn up, but not for training, but for discussion with their commander. Okay, so you can see the depth of this the depth of this schism within the Israeli ruling bourgeoisie. Now, what is it really about? They say it's about preserving Israel as a liberal democracy. Now, the liberal description of this section in Israel as in the United States is, of course, a facade and not to be taken literally, but it is really fictitious. I mean, their liberalism is largely fictitious, but in Israel, it is doubly fictitious in a way that doesn't apply, for example, in the United States. Israel is a fake democracy in more senses than other bourgeois so-called democracies. Let me give, I mean, this notion of Israel as a liberal democracy is based on blatant fictions in a way that is really sort of very extreme. Well, let's start from the oldest fiction about Israel being not being a nuclear power. Israel doesn't admit to being a nuclear power. Everybody knows that it is, but Israel is not admitting it. Okay. Israel is supposed to be a democracy. Now, this fiction is maintained while in my rough estimate, 36% of the population under Israel rule has no rights whatsoever. 14% have some rights, but in a very limited sense. Now, these, of course, are the Palestinian Arabs. 36% of the population under Israeli control are Palestinian Arabs under what? What regime? Occupation. Israel doesn't even admit that the occupied territories are occupied territories. Because if it did admit that they are occupied territories, it would commit itself to apply the international legal system regarding occupied territories. So they are not occupied territories. In fact, they are annexed territories, but Israel doesn't admit that they are annexed. It describes their status in an ambiguous way as contested territories. Okay, so one of the fictions of this so-called liberal democracy is that 36% of the people under its rule are in a sort of limbo, not occupied, not annexed, but in fact, de facto annexed. This is such an obvious and outrageous fiction that does not apply in other cases. Of course, remaining 14% of the population are Palestinian Arabs who are citizens of Israel who have some rights, but not full equal rights. Another fiction that this liberal section of the bourgeoisie subscribes to is the two-state fiction. that a solution to the colonial conflict, they don't regard it, of course, as a colonial conflict. The conflict with the Palestinian Arabs is going to be in a two-state arrangement. Of course, this is long been exposed as a complete deception. And it is a deception that is used simply as a cover in order to be able to present the Israeli state as a kind of liberal democracy. These fictions are important to the so-called liberal section of the Israeli ruling class. It is important for their own self-image, and it is important for their contacts and connections with their class correlates in other countries, as well as with the Jewish diaspora. It is important for them to maintain these fictions, partly outright deception and a lot of it self-deception, but it is important for them to maintain it. It is important for them to maintain the fiction that the Israeli Supreme Court exercises some kind of impartiality or genuine imposition of democratic norms. So this is, of course, complete fiction. As far as international law application to the occupied territories, the Supreme Court has long refused to rule that international law on occupied territories applies to Israel, to the West Bank, or let alone the Gaza Strip. In practice, the Israeli judicial system is heavily biased against Palestinians and for the colonial Zionist regime. But the fiction is important to them. They don't want to lose it. And of course, they don't want to lose their power. On the other hand, the populist bourgeoisie doesn't care about these niceties. For them, they are, as in other countries, typically very crude. They don't want the mosque. They want a powerless Supreme Court open, a powerless Supreme Court officially. They want official annexation. They don't want the cover facade of ambiguity about the status of the occupied territories. They want to annex them officially. They want open apartheid and eventual ethnic cleansing. They openly speak about the eventual solution to the Palestinian problem as expulsion. And they want open concessions to religious fundamentalism and to regressive social legislation. A case that illustrates this is the following. The Minister of National Security, Ben-Gvir, who is, by the way, never served, I mean, compare this to the militaristic aspect of the liberal bourgeoisie. He, one of the leaders of the populist bourgeoisie, never served in the Israeli army. He doesn't have any sort of military experience. But he is demanding official immunity to Israeli soldiers for any deeds in the occupied territories, right? If they wantonly killed a Palestinian or several Palestinians, they should not be prosecuted for this. Of course, the higher commanders are horrified by this. Why? Because one of the fictions that protects them is that the Israeli judicial system investigates, and the army itself investigates such cases. This is necessary as to prevent these higher-ups being called in front of the International Criminal Court in The Hague for allowing such things to happen. a principle governing the procedures of the International Criminal Court is that they don't look into cases in which the country where these crimes take place is itself investigating. So Israel maintains the fiction that if an Israeli soldier murders a Palestinian, then this case is investigated. Of course, it is investigated, quote unquote. This is one of the fictions, but it is an important fiction for these higher ups. But Ben-Gvir is appealing to working class, ordinary soldiers who are not ever likely to be called to the Hague. They don't care if the ICC calls some higher up. It's not one of their class. His appeal is to ordinary, mostly working class Israeli soldiers, and he wants them to be immune from prosecution in Israel. So this is in a sense a class conflict, right? But it is disguised under the mantle of right-wing extremists versus liberal ideology. I want to draw to a conclusion. In a sense, I mean, it's very difficult to predict what is going to happen. Power seems to be draining away from Netanyahu and his associates. An indicative, minor occurrence that wasn't reported abroad, but that I think is significant, what occurred on the 13th of March on Channel 12 of Israeli television. Normally, until that date, in the most highly watched slot on television, that is the early afternoon news, Netanyahu was allowed to come up to and be interviewed, and the interview consisted of a long speech in which he put forward his accusations against his adversaries, full of lies, of course. I mean, the person is a liar who would beat our own Johnston and Trump in the contest of liarship. But suddenly on the 13th of March, the presenter of Channel 12 in Israeli television, it's a private channel, curtailed his speech and allowed him only to speak for a couple of minutes, and then gave a summary of the rest of the speech. This is something unprecedented for this channel. What is also noticeable that he is absenting himself from the events. He's now engaged in a series of travels abroad to various parts of the world. This is very strange for the head of a government in the midst of an unprecedented, historically unprecedented crisis. I mean, this is something very remarkable. He's simply away most of the time. Of course, he finds it a bit difficult to get out of the country because demonstrators are blocking the entrance to Lida Airport. In one of his forages abroad, he had to be brought to the airport by helicopter because the roads were blocked by demonstrators. It is actually predicted in today's Haaretz. I read the following. A month from today, that is in today's Haaretz, a month from today, we may not know who gives orders to the Israeli military or police. How is that going to happen? The Knesset is going to very probably legislate some very extreme laws confining and restricting and cutting the powers of the Supreme Court. Now, it is quite possible and even probable that the Supreme Court will throw out this legislation. But this very legislation is designed to make it impossible for the Supreme Court to do this kind of thing. So there will be a constitutional standoff between the legislative and the ruling government and the Supreme Court. Who is going to give the orders? The head of the Israeli military will be put in a position that he will have to choose whether to obey the Supreme Court or the government, the executive part of the state. This is a profound constitutional crisis. I find it impossible to make short-term predictions as to what might happen in case of this kind of unprecedented constitutional crisis. I think personally that in the medium term, the populist bourgeoisie is going to win. The powers behind the present government are going to win because the logic of the historical process of Zionist colonization points in this direction. But of course, this is only a speculation. This is not a precise prediction. By the way, the President Netanyahu government was too much in a hurry to make this a huge raft of reactionary and regressive legislation. Had they proceeded, had they found it possible to proceed more gradually, they may have been able to get away with it. You see, if you take, for example, Hungary, the change in Hungary came by degrees. It was sort of the salami method. It is possible that if Netanyahu and his partners had chosen to proceed more judiciously, if you can use this term, and tactically, they could have gotten away with it. But they were in a hurry. They were in a hurry for various reasons, because they proceeded in such a hurry that it's been compared to what the Nazi party did in 1933 when it first won the elections in Germany. Immediately, they went ahead with the huge amount of legislation which pinned the Nazi regime in power. This comparison is not mine. It's been made by Israeli commentators. But they were in a hurry for various reasons. One of them is Netanyahu's personal need to get an immediate getaway, get out of jail card. I mean, he's on trial for various indictments of corruption, bribery, etc., etc. By the way, one of the laws that is now being pushed through the Israeli Knesset is a law actually permitting bribery. I mean, it's hardly even disguised. It allows not only politicians but also senior servants of the government to accept financial gifts if they are designed to help them to guess what? To hire lawyers when they are on trial. So I mean, this is or if to pay for medical expenses for them or their family members. I mean, this is an explicit law legalizing bribery, but we'll see whether this gets through. So as I said, in the short term, it's very difficult to predict what is going to happen. In the medium term, I think my feeling is that the populist of the present government will win, because the logic of Israeli colonialism points in this way. Thank you.
If you remember, during Trump's November, I can't remember, was it 18 or 18, I think, visit to Saudi Arabia, there was this picture of Netanyahu bin Salman and Trump standing next to a globe, and it's a very weird image. I don't have it at hand to show you, but this was supposed to be the new Middle East, Israel and Saudi Arabia allies forever. As Moshé alluded, Iran and Israel are at war. It's a Cold War, but it's a war. And we see signs of it in Iran. Things are hacked. Nuclear scientists are killed randomly in the streets of Tehran. And Mossad more or less openly claims that this was an action by their agents. Iran's Islamic Republic is probably less reliable, but they also produce every now and then details to say this particular action was done by this or other Israeli agent. Very often they lie, but in the case of assassination of nuclear scientists, physics graduates, physics professors, they are right. These are Israeli people. Hacking is getting a bit weird. Israel hacks into motorways in Iran, creating traffic chaos. I think on one occasion, they hacked into the train services computers. And Iran does its best also to do, but I think with less effectiveness. This doesn't mean that Iran is terribly behind Israel, but it is behind Israel in terms of IT. And here, some of the competition between the two countries is not just that they dislike each other. I would say Iran's support for Palestinians has been pretty more rhetoric, more slogans than actual real support for Palestinians, with the exception of Islamic Jihad, which is their ally. Their differences with Hamas were accentuated at the height of troubles with Saudi Arabia. Iran and Hamas were on different sides regarding Syria. On lots of issues, Iran and Hamas haven't had a close relationship, despite the fact that Netanyahu and others keep putting the two in one sentence. But that, on the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, let us remember, it's the way you associate names and then that justifies attacking them. So if the US wants Israel to attack Iran, it's very good to keep saying Hamas and the Islamic Republic are more or less the same thing. So attacking one is in retaliation for an action that happened in the occupied territories. However, we do live in a different world to 2018. And it's not just that China is a more powerful economic country, which it is, no doubt, but it's also that the Ukraine war has changed attitudes towards the United States in some ways. In a very strange way, you could say that on the whole, countries of the global south are not as enthusiastic about this war as the European Union, Britain, the US, Canada. And here we see the conflict between Saudi Arabia and US to start with, where the Biden administration's repeated attempts to get Saudi Arabia to produce more oil to help reduce the price of oil haven't worked. And that leaves at least US's European allies in a very strange position, because on the one hand, they are desperate for cheaper fuel. On the other hand, given the walkout by the Trump administration of the Iran nuclear deals, they can't buy Iranian oil, cheap Iranian oil on the black market, and unannounced is still going to China. However, contrary to what many Iranians believe, China's main economic partner in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia. 22% of the oil from Saudi Arabia, in its entire oil, goes to China. The two countries in 2021 had something like $87 billion of trade between them. So when it comes to Saudi Arabia, yes, it doesn't want to diss the United States, at least openly, but unofficially it has done so by not following the rules, the regulation about oil. But on the other hand, it has a major economic ally, the Chinese government. And therefore, it has, if you like, choices. And those choices means that at a time when it is concerned about the United Arab Emirates and the way it is using its economic base for apparently Russian oligarch money as a base, at a time when the war in Yemen isn't won by Saudis, at a time when they don't want to go back to the support they were giving officially or unofficially to jihadists and Salafis. Peace with Iran has advantages. Apart from anything else, I think Saudi Arabia is concerned with presenting a united front of Muslim countries. For Iran, it's desperation. There is no doubt. There is serious economic difficulties. There are major problems with the currency. Every time Biden or Blinken announce a new policy, the currency in Iran drops another 10%. You could say in this desperation, given the fact that they have protests inside the country, given the fact that Israel is creating this soft war with Iran, the choices were very limited and they were keen. However, this peace didn't happen overnight, and China, as the broker, played a very important role, asserting its authority in the region. This is probably the first time in the Middle East where China is saying, look, we can produce peace. We can produce an agreement between two warring countries. So the implications for the United States that has now officially welcomed this deal are understandable. It's not good. I don't think they were celebrating. But what was terrible was for Netanyahu. Apparently, he was flying to Rome as the news broke out on the 3rd of March. And according to what we read, I mean, we can't be 100% sure, but according to what we read, he was trying to get hold of Biden, desperate to find out what the US reaction would be. Later, they claimed, oh, we knew about this. Saudi Arabia had informed us. I doubt it, because it wasn't even in the gift of Saudi Arabia to inform Israel. It's China that is brokering this deal. It's China that was hosting this, and there was an embargo on giving information to anybody. Quite a few people in the Iranian government were quite surprised by this deal, so I doubt it. Saudis told Israel at least the extent of the deal. It's a face-saving comment by Netanyahu's administration. We then had what I call economic consequences of this. So the Saudi trade minister is going to Iran. He's already announced that Saudi Arabia is keen to invest in Iran. You can see why. They have lots of money, they don't have a lot of industry. The population in Iran is much larger, is more computer literate, investment can work for Saudi Arabia. I assume Credit Suisse going down doesn't help, banks are not reliable, so maybe you do invest in your enemy's country. What isn't very clear is what will happen to the Yemen war, partly because the Houthis haven't said they will follow, some of them have said we will not obey Iran. They haven't said we'll continue the war, but they've said we have our own agenda and we will not necessarily obey Iran. Well, all of this brings me back to the infamous nuclear deal brokered in 2015, broken in 2018 unilaterally by the Trump administration. The very difficult situations that the European Union finds itself in, where it wants the deal to work, it wants to get back into trade with Iran, but it can't afford the kind of sanctions that, the kind of penalties that sanction busting will create. For China, that's not a problem. It's doing it. Apparently, tankers of tons of oil and gas leave Iran and get to China, and there's no problem. But for the European Union, that's not an alternative. So the European Union is keen on this. But both the European Union and US are following what I would call a very dangerous, but at the same time, you can see the reasons why they're doing it, a dual policy. That dual policy is to continue the discussion with Iran, but constantly threaten it with regime change from above. Now, the protests inside Iran had nothing to do with regime change from above. They were genuine protests, contrary to what the supporters of the Islamic Republic will tell you in Britain or anywhere else. And in fact, the government itself admits it, supported it now inside Iran. People come and say, yes, these were genuine protests. Yes, there are a very large proportion of the young in Iran who don't like the clergy, who don't like the current system. And and there are debates on national TV where people talk about why these protests took place and why is the government so unpopular? So you can't say any of this had to do with regime change from above. But as always, especially in the absence of revolutionary alternatives, progressive alternatives, the diaspora, and especially the right-wing diaspora, with financial support that they were always getting from institutions such as the National Endowment for Democracy in the US, which is a Zionist, neoconservative, pro-Israel think tank, and similar organizations. The right has managed to present itself as, if you like, the alternative to the current regime. And the right is led, according to Financial Times, and they are correct in doing that, by Reza Pahlavi, the Shah's, ex-Shah's son. And you can see that the US administration, the Biden administration, is pushing that line. You can say this with level of confidence because of the way finances are going to this regime change from above, the way the media controlled by the US, such as Voice of America and the BBC because World Service BBC is directly under the influence of the Foreign Office. So the way BBC Persian is presenting Reza Pahlavi and so on. And in fact, in some ways, you can hear the large demonstrations in Iran giving slogans against this alternative. We don't want Khamenei, we don't want the Shah. They are very clear. You can't see nurses protest, workers protest, large demonstration where this isn't one of the main slogans, not a side slogan. But who cares? I mean, if you're Biden, you've got your own agenda. And here we have a so-called leader who will make Chalabi look like a very intelligent, astute politician. Chalabi, if you remember, was the man the US was promoting 20 years ago this time against Saddam Hussein. And here we have, I mean, this is a guy who hasn't been interested in politics for most of the 40 years. He spent his youth in a Swiss boarding school as a teenager until he was 17. But as my fellow schoolmates keep telling me, he can't speak French very well either. His English is okay because he's lived 40 years in the US, mainly, and here you can rely on his own social media presence, pictures that he hasn't deleted or other people have kept, mainly on holiday in the Caribbean, in Miami, in various places where famous celebrities go, he's with the celebrities, and in Las Vegas and other casinos. So this is not exactly what you would call a politician or a strong man who can save US. As I keep saying, it would actually be quite good if they choose him, because deposing this idiot should be easier once the US has lost interest in him. But I don't think he is the choice. I think he remains the bogeyman to scare Iran's Islamic Republic. Israel is also supporting him. Israel's Persian-speaking radio and TV is often presenting him as the liberal Democrat. I mean, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East that Moshé was explaining to us. So it's obvious that they want another democracy in Iran, hopefully in a smaller Iran, because as part of that strategy, they also want to divide Iran into lots of little countries, and then you have solved the Iran problem, irrespective of who comes to power. So Israel is a great defender of the Kurdish people. Luckily for us, most of the Kurdish people don't have any time in Iran, don't have any time, unlike Iraqi Kurdistan, where support for Israel was relatively high. We don't have that in Iran, but that doesn't stop Israel hoping for the best. And I think here we also obviously have nostalgia among sections of the population, mainly the middle classes and the rich. Inside the country, there is some nostalgia. We can blame the Islamic Republic because the situation is so awful that the Shah's era is being presented as a good time. And there's even debate on the national TV, on the various various newspapers and so on, about whether the Islamic Republic was wrong in just depicting, if you like, the extremes of the Pahlavi era, which are most of which are true, actually. It's not just the Islamic Republic saying. We all have enough proof for example, Shah's sister being one of the main drug traffickers of the 70s in the Middle East. And in fact, she wanted to become the UN's women's, I don't know, chair or something. And the reply from the UN was, no, we do want someone from Iran's royal family in this post, but not her. She's got too much of a reputation, international reputation as a drug dealer, or various other stories about the Pahlavi. But the reality is that the world has changed. So yes, it is true to say that the Gini factor of 44 years after revolutions that was supposed to be bringing the poor or looking after the poor in Iran, the Islamic Republic claimed it was a revolution to support the demands of bare feet, people who couldn't afford shoes, and now we're in a situation where, yes, there are some billionaires, but the majority of the population are facing abject poverty and so on. But I think it's wrong to present such arguments, as some of them are presented on Iranian national inside the country, as simply a better economic situation under the Shah. Because what we are looking at is a world where the gap between the rich and the poor has increased everywhere. This is the neoliberal era. It is 40 years of neoliberalism. The Islamic Republic's problem is that it has been part of that neoliberal capitalist economies, and that has increased poverty. Quite a lot of the protests in Iran are against the abolition of subsidies. And that again is the diktat of the International Monetary Fund in exchange for the loans that Iran has. So it's a very complicated story. And yes, we should blame the Islamic Republic for, if you like, creating such a hell that people compare the hell under the Shah with the current hell. But we can also blame the Iranian left. And here I will finish on this. The Iranian left, as you know, is often blamed for, and this is wrong because it was only a very particular section of the Iranian left, for supporting Khomeini. That wasn't true. It was the Tudeh party and Tadaini majority, i.e. the forces who were very pro-Soviet, and the Trotskyist groups who thought the Soviet Union was a deformed worker state. Only these groups that supported Khomeini. Everybody else, which did numerically outnumber this lot by 10 to 1, maybe 20 to 1, the majority didn't support the Islamic Republic and paid a very heavy price because they were arrested, they were executed. The executions of 1980, 81, 87, mass executions in 87 were all of the left. It isn't true to say that the left supported Khomeini, but in the world where complicated facts have to be summed up in short sentences, idiots say this and other idiots repeat it. But as a result of this notion that sections of the left did support Khomeini, sections of the left, both inside Iran and outside Iran, and mainly outside Iran, are now saying, oh, we were mistaken not to support the liberals just before Khomeini came to power and during Khomeini's time. And you think, well, would that have done anything better? Well, first of all, Bakhtiar was the man that Carter had the Guadeloupe conference and the G7, I think at the time, had decided would be the caretaker. He decided he didn't want to keep power after a while because he could see how big the religious support for Khomeini was. So I'm not sure how anyone could have supported Bakhtiar. But in terms of opposition to workers' protests, opposition to democratic rights, national rights, and all the rest of it, Iran's liberals have never been any better than other so-called Middle Eastern liberals, i.e. they're for democracy as long as no one disagrees with them. As soon as someone disagrees with them, they're terrorists, they should be arrested, they should be attacked. So this notion that somehow it's the left's problem for not supporting the liberals in the first years of the Islamic Republic is another nonsense that people have come up in order to justify what I would call this move to the right in the Iranian left that now is soft on criticizing Reza Pahlavi. I don't stop doing it, and some of my comrades don't stop doing it, not just because he's an idiot, not just because this is a reactionary path, but this concept of a united front against the Islamic Republic, supporting a reactionary pro-US regime change alternative as in order to get rid of the Islamic Republic is repeating the very error we made in 1979, or some people made. I personally didn't, but some people did, in opposing the Shah and allying yourself to Khomeini and the religious movement, because the main enemy is, after all, the Shah. Let's first get rid of him. So I'll stop here and